episode 24, Reformed White Supremacists Now Leading the Fight Against Extremism, Christian Picciolini. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Christian Picciolini. Christian is an Emmy Award-winning director and producer, a published author, a TEDx speaker, and a reformed extremist. He is the co-founder of Life After Hate, a nonprofit organization dedicated to finding long-term solutions that counter racism and violent extremism. His latest book is titled White American Youth: My Descent into America's Most Violent Hate Movement and How I Got Out. Christian, welcome to the program.
Glenn, it's really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's my pleasure. Well, let's go back, I guess somewhat to the beginning. As a teenager, you had mentioned that you were bullied quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start there. Why were you bullied? What was different about you? Because that maybe was some of the underpinning of your, being swayed at some point.
I didn't really know very clearly what my identity was. And I was very insecure because of that. So my parents are Italian immigrants who came to the U.S. in the mid-'60s. Being a first-generation American, it was really hard to understand which world I needed to live in. And I think most people don't know is 25% of American youth are either first-generation or second-generation Americans. And that's a problem for trying to understand who you are. So for me, it was really a breakdown of my identity, my community, and what I thought my purpose was.
And along those lines, where were your parents during all of this? Were they helpful? Were they not there? What sort of family unit did you have?
I had a very, very strong family unit, in fact, except because my parents were immigrants, they had to work a little bit harder, and that kept them away from home 7 days a week, sometimes 14 hours a day, running a small business in Chicago. And they were, satisfied I was being raised by grandparents and aunts and uncles. But as a young kid, you want to be recognized by your parents. So I mistook that as abandonment. And I really started to resent them for that. Of course, now, at 44 years old, having left that movement, 22 years ago, being a parent myself of young teens or young men, I really mistook that as something else. And it was them working hard is what it was.
When you were just 14, you were recruited to join Chicago area skinheads by its founder. What was the message to you? What did he say at that time that resonated so strongly?
Well, in fact, I still remember the first encounter very, very vividly. I was barely 14 years old, and I was standing in an alley smoking a joint. And this car pulled up, Firebird, and this man came out with a shaved head and boots. And it was 1987, so nobody really in America knew what a skinhead was. And he walked over towards me, and he pulled a joint from my lips, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, "That's what the Jews and the communists want you to do to keep you docile." And at 14, I can tell you I had no idea what a communist or a Jew was, or even what the word docile meant. It was the first time as though I felt somebody was giving me a lifeline out of this powerlessness, out of this marginalization, out of this confusion that I was feeling. But I was also very driven. And he pulled me in very benignly. Then he started to just, provide me with a community. There were, other skinheads that lived across that alley. And in fact, that man, Clark Martel, was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead leader. That movement, that neo-Nazi skinhead movement, started in Chicago in 1984. And I was recruited in 1987. And I spent the next 8 years of my life as a member of America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group, which I eventually led.
Before we move on, I want to go back to that moment. So he approaches you, and the comment when you were smoking the joint was That's what the Jews and the communists want you to do to keep you docile. So what exactly did he mean by that?
Oh, I at 14 years old, I couldn't have understood it. Now I know, having recruited people myself, it was always about filling the voids in people, understanding their vulnerabilities, taking their anger and their fear and then projecting it onto other groups. Because it was never our fault, all the terrible things that occurred in our lives. All the grievances we had were always directed at the other. So what he meant by the communists and the Jews trying to keep me docile was that he was taking my pain and he was blaming somebody else for it. And by doing that, he threw me a lifeline. He was the first person that actually stood and talked to me. And I thought at that point he was saying things that I should have known. How did I not know this stuff? This man who's charismatic, who's dressed like a warrior, is giving me the secret information and I don't know it. I'm not going to admit that I don't know it. It was, teenagers are vulnerable people. And that's why I'm very concerned about what's happening in our country today.
Well, looking back, I can see how it was this opportunity to move from the powerless to the powerful, from a nobody to a somebody. But surely there were plenty of other organizations you could have joined to create a sense of identity and a sense of community. So why was a white supremacist group in itself so alluring? Like, were there any pre-existing prejudices or biases that might have pushed you in that direction a little bit?
No, I mean, my parents, when they came to the U.S. in the mid-'60s, were often the victims of prejudice themselves. So it wasn't, part of my family DNA. It wasn't part of my foundation. I didn't know anything about it. Frankly, I thought pretty much everybody in the world was Italian because I lived so, in my bubble that at that age, I didn't really know. But no, I mean, what he did was he used the place where I lived, which was Blue Island, Illinois, a very blue collar, lower middle class, kind of enclave right on the edge of the southwest side of Chicago that was surrounded by minority communities. And he would then start to use the fear rhetoric of them coming into the neighborhood to take away what was ours. Because that's really where prejudice and hatred comes from, is people, first of all, they hate themselves and they're trying to project their own pain, but also they are trying to find somebody else to pin their anger on. It's all about, hatred is born of ignorance. Fear is its father and isolation is its mother. I firmly believe that. When we are afraid of what we don't understand and we are so isolated from it, sometimes that turns into hatred and in heated moments that turns into violence.
What's the ultimate goal of organizations like that?
It's really hard to say, Glenn, because those movements are driven by very egotistical, very low self-confidence people. And I think, ego is driven by ego, but their goal ultimately, I think, is to make the world simpler. And in their eyes, to make it simpler is to only surround themselves with people that are exactly like them, because they are afraid of everything that's different. They are afraid of something that is non-traditional. And they mistake, their fear as hatred for other people who might be coming in, progress. Progress happens. And they're afraid of progress.
Well, we can all see what happens at these rallies, but I'd like you to maybe take me behind the scenes at a neo-Nazi meeting. What's the vibe? What's being discussed? What's happening there?
I actually write a very vivid chapter of my book, of my first kind of meeting, where the Hammerskin Nation was just being discussed and formed, and the Hammerskin Nation ended up being, and still today is one of the most deadly hate groups in the world, unfortunately. But what happens is what you don't hear on the streets. So the strategies in these meetings are about how can we make ourselves seem less hateful to the outside? Because at one point we recognized, even 30 years ago, that we were turning people away that we wanted to recruit because we were too edgy, because we had shaved heads and wore boots and had swastika tattoos. And that was turning people away. So we decided 30 years ago that we needed to blend in, that we needed to, grow our hair out, that we needed to ditch our boots and get suits. and go to college campuses to recruit and even enroll, because we knew that they were fertile ground for kind of idealistic people shaping their minds, who were maybe confused about which direction they wanted to go. We encourage people to join the military, to get training, and to get jobs in law enforcement, to essentially look and sound and act just like the people that we were trying to recruit. And then through very, perceived or maybe even sometimes real grievances that the average American had, those people would then go in and recruit the same way that I was recruited, by finding the vulnerabilities and the cracks and then filling them in with broken promises of paradise.
It's interesting you mentioned the dress, because if you look at the rally from Charlottesville, to take a recent example, both sides of the aisle, they're dressing almost identically. You can't really separate who's who. So I guess that sounds like that was by design decades back, to really go through that assimilation process.
Yeah, and it's exactly by design. But to be honest, we never thought it would work, because we were so entrenched in being outspoken that, a lot of folks didn't want to tone it down and make the message more palatable. But some did. More of the pseudo-intellectual faction did. And now we're, talking about terms like the alt-right and white nationalists. And I really dislike those terms, because I know that those are terms that they sat in those meetings that you're talking about and that we're talking about and said, what can we call ourselves to make ourselves seem less hateful? So, we used to, back in 30 years ago, we used to call ourselves white separatists instead of white supremacists, or even white pride, which was typically a way we led most conversations. You should be proud to be white. Everybody else is proud to be who they are. You should be proud to be white, which now we're seeing as white lives matter, or it's okay to be white. And those messages resonate with people because they're not understanding the message from the other side. Groups like Black Lives Matter are not only about Black lives. They recognize that all lives matter, but they're speaking right now for the voiceless. And that's why they're getting so much support, but that's also why they're getting maligned so much by the other side, because they're twisting the use of Black Lives Matter to White Lives Matter, and making themselves the victim and using them as, using the victim narrative, which is a common tactic.
Well, you weren't just a follower of this movement, but when that leader that you had mentioned who recruited you, I think was put behind bars for some period of time, then you took over leadership. Why you? Were you more fervent than the others, more charismatic?
I think I was more driven. I was always ambitious, even as a shy, introverted kid. From as early as I could remember, I was the one who would sit in my grandparents' big coat closet and write up hotel plans, or make magazines at 8, 9, 10 years old. And at 14 years old, even though I was withdrawn and on the fringes, I was still very ambitious. I believed in myself. And at 16 years old, when he went to prison, a lot of the police had really come down on the organization. So a lot of the older first generation people, if you will, went to prison or were running or were in hiding for fear of being caught. So I was essentially the last man standing at 16 years old. And everybody who had been recruited after me essentially looked to me and said, what do we do? And I took the reins. I was, I saw it as an entrepreneurial kind of investment for myself at that time, not understanding the repercussions of what I was involved in, not understanding the magnitude of the pain that would cause, not only to my victims, but all the people that I recruited, because I altered their lives.
Well, was the movement mostly about violent rhetoric, or was there actual physical violence as well?
It was about both, and the violent rhetoric and the fear rhetoric drove the actual violence. I was in one of America's earliest white power bands, and two of them, in fact, and in the first band to travel outside of the U.S. to perform in Europe. And the violent lyrics, the violent rhetoric, was both propaganda and incitement to violence. So they kind of went hand in hand back then. There were factions that were driven by marketing, let's say, that were more about spreading conspiracy theories or what we're calling fake news now. We still had a web back then that spread fake news. We would send books and pamphlets and leaflets to people. We would drop them in their mailboxes. We would put it on windshield wipers, and we spread it the same way that it's spreading now to the average person without giving them all the facts. A leading headline that blamed somebody else for something that might be happening in that person's life to get them to just look into it a little bit further. And we're still seeing the magnitude of that happening now, on the internet.
Well, you officially renounced your ties to the neo-Nazi and the white supremacist movement when you were 22. Do you recall the exact moment when you decided that the world of hate and violence is no longer in the cards for you?
Well, I had doubts every one of those days of those 8 years that I was involved. My children being born were a major catalyst in 1992 and 1994. I eventually led and left the movement in 95, early 96. And that challenged my priorities. On one hand, was I this hate monger or was I a father? What was my identity? My community, was it the one that I had manufactured around me to boost my own ego? Or was it the one I physically had given life to? And was my purpose to scorch the earth or to actually make it a good place for my 2 sons and my wife to live in? I was 19 years old when we had our first child and 21 when we had our second. That really challenged my sense of identity, community, and purpose and helped me reprioritize. And to some degree, when my son was born in 92 and I held him for the first time, it really reconnected me with the innocence that I lost at 14, because I had literally gone from playing, with Transformers toys to shaving my head, wearing boots, and beating people up. Yeah, it just challenged me. But along the way, I also met people who, showed me compassion when I least deserved it at a time. And they were the people that I least deserved it from. Let me just say, I opened a record store in 94 to sell white power music and to support my family. And I also sold other music like punk rock and hip hop and heavy metal. And when those customers came in to buy that music, they showed me compassion. They saw something inside of me that I didn't even see. And they continued to do that until I was able to humanize them, because I had been demonizing them in my head, the prejudice. And it was the connection of actually meeting these people that I had disconnected from my whole life. Because even prior to 14, I lived in such a small Italian bubble that I never really got a chance to integrate. And now I was humanizing them and realizing I had more in common with them than the people I'd surrounded myself with.
Well, for the last couple decades, you've dedicated your life to dismantling what you helped build. Talk about some of the work that you do with Life After Hate. What are some of the approaches you utilize to counter this extremist movement?
I've actually left Life After Hate. It's been about 6 months to launch a global intervention provider network. So because of all my travels, I've got a chance to meet all these amazing groups in all parts of the world, from Africa to North America to South America and even, Europe and parts of Asia, who are doing essentially the same type of work that I do when I help people disengage from violent extremism. But these are groups of mothers who are working with returned foreign fighters or, ex-foreign fighters who are working to help young people not go down the same path that they've done. I want to bring that all together so that we can create one hub with a global set of resources to help anybody escape from any type of violent extremism, and essentially arm communities to diffuse these situations before they even happen by providing the right services to make people more resilient, so that they don't have to go down that path. If they have what I call potholes, trauma, the things in life that kind of nudge them off of the main road onto a detoured path, things like job training, things like tattoo removal, things like education, or even mental health therapy. Those are the types of things that we know counter violent extremism. It's not about ideology or dogma. People don't go to those movements because of that. They go to those movements for acceptance. They go there because they see a stronger identity there, and maybe they've hit a wall enough times and felt disenfranchised that they needed to associate with a negative group to get what they needed.
Well, there's two different approaches, it sounds like. There's trying to talk people out of the movement that have already engaged. And then there's the more preemptive approach of let's catch them when they're most vulnerable before they join. I want to talk about the latter for a minute, and then I want to talk about the former in terms of some of the counseling you've done. So you've got lots of teenagers, they're disenfranchised, they're powerless, they don't have a voice, they're being ostracized, bullied, etc. How do you find them? And what do you do at that point to give them some alternative path to pursue?
Well, I think we can all do the job of finding them. It's been difficult for me and overwhelming because of all the hundreds and hundreds of parents, bystanders, even people themselves who've come to me for help, disengaging either a loved one or themselves from this movement. But we can all identify the signs. There is no profile for this. I want to be clear that this could happen to anybody. We need to do better for our young people, our most vulnerable people. If we see something that they're passionate about, we need to reinforce that. If we see somebody who's withdrawn or is being bullied, we need to find a way to amplify what it is that they love to do to steer them in a direction and stop the bullying as well. We need to provide a better platform for young people to be heard and make them more accountable in their education at the youngest levels possible. But more than anything else, we need to provide opportunity where opportunity doesn't exist. Because in so many places, and I live in Chicago, Chicago's an amazing city that's very diverse, but it's also very segregated. You can see a stark difference from the privilege and the services that are available to certain citizens, even educational institutions. There just aren't schools, there aren't grocery stores, there aren't businesses, there aren't factories in impoverished urban areas. We need to do a better job of providing opportunity, because joining a gang is no different than joining a white supremacist group, is no different than joining ISIS and flying to Syria. It's about a grievance. It's about feeling something is taken away from you, but it's also about, and more, about acceptance. It's about belonging to something that is bigger than yourself. And if you have cracks, if you have voids, if you have those potholes that have been unfilled and you've been unable to navigate, they will promise you, and to a degree deliver, what it is that you need to fill those potholes. But then, after you've given up everything in your life, your family, your friends, your hobbies to join this movement, and you realize that what you're fighting for is wrong because you see the things that they do, because they change. They bring you in through a sense of pride, but then it immediately turns into, hate your enemy and kill your enemy. But by that time, you've given up everything you love. It's hard to go back. So when I work with people and they come to me or I find them, it's really about making sure that they understand and giving them a new community and understanding their identity and reshaping their purpose. It's about making them stronger, more foundation, more solid foundation within them to move forward.
And when they didn't have that and they signed up and now they're full-fledged flag-carrying member, I know you've done a lot of counseling with some of these folks. How does that conversation start? What do you say to them? How do you talk them off the ledge, so to speak?
I listen. More than I speak, I listen. And I listen for those potholes. And oftentimes they don't know that they're even communicating those potholes to me. These people who go to extremist movements, whether we're talking about the right, the left, ISIS, they want to be heard. And part of why they're there is because they've not felt heard. And maybe I'm more equipped to listen to some of their rhetoric because I've said it. But oftentimes, because they trust me, that stops quickly and they start talking about personal issues. They start talking about their wives or their children or their parents or how they grew up or the fact that their father left or abused them. It could go on and on and on. And those are the potholes. Or, I can see the signs of mental illness and I'll call in a professional, colleague, psychologist who can help me determine if maybe what led them to that is being untreated for, a mental condition. Maybe that's why they're socially awkward and have been marginalized and have gravitated to this group because they're the only ones that have shown them acceptance. It's so complicated because every person is different. But what I'm essentially listening for is the signs, the symptoms of how I both treat and cure, quote unquote, because I really approach this the same way that, Dr. Salk approached polio. I have to treat the people who are sick, which are the people who are indoctrinated, right? And that is by listening and then providing them things to make them more resilient. The way that I prevent it is by inoculating the population. We have to get the truth out there. The biggest thing that is under attack right now is the truth. And once we lose that, we're doomed. There's so much information out there and such an attack of propaganda that the truth is becoming very muddled and people are now arguing over lies on both sides. not understanding that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And that is the thing that scares me the most.
Well, you've said before that since 9/11, more Americans have been killed on U.S. soil by white supremacists than any foreign or homegrown terrorist organization. Yet we still don't call it terrorism.
Right. It's something that I think in our nation's history we've never really been able to do. I mean, it's hard to hold a mirror up to ourselves and see the cracks. I mean, we've made progress, but until we recognize it, start calling it terrorism, it's just not going to get the same attention, the same services, or even take up the same brain space among the population that it exists. Which is why when I speak to people like you, it's so important to understand that everybody from Timothy McVeigh to Dylan Roof to Wade Michael Page, all these people, there are 10 more that we don't hear about that happen, that don't go reported as hate crimes or as racially based murders or as anything associated with this white supremacist movement. Why we don't call it out in the media, I don't know. And I think that may be just an unconscious bias that as Americans we just have towards anybody who is not American, rather than saying that we might be at fault for things.
Well, you mentioned how over the years there's been this assimilation, not just in terms of what people look like, but in terms of messaging and what they call themselves and, softer language, et cetera. What's even scarier is how intelligent and articulate these leaders are. I mean, Richard Spencer was pursuing his PhD when he left to become a white supremacist leader. Steve Bannon went to Harvard. You're incredibly well-spoken and intelligent yourself and well-educated. So you'd almost like to think that the ignorance and the fear-mongering stems from those who are very isolated from the broader community and not well-educated. But it's not the case, is it?
No, it's not the case. And I think most people think that, people who gravitate towards this movement are not educated. They're poor. They live in rural areas, and that's just not the truth. The fact is that people who are smart, who are educated, who have money also have potholes. They just may not be the same ones that we've prejudiced ourselves to think are the potholes, like poverty and unemployment, and lack of education. People like Steve Bannon and Richard Spencer. I spent 2 hours face to face with Richard Spencer. I invited him to one of my talks in Whitefish, Montana, which was recently, just last year, the victim of a troll storm that attacked the Jewish community there. Richard Spencer lives there, as does his mother, but he also spends half of his time in Virginia. And his wife and daughter are there. So there was, the community, first of all, was attacked by an organization online called the Daily Stormer, where people were getting thousands of death threats. They were threatening an armed march down Main Street. I had the opportunity, when I was there, I kind of soft trolled Richard Spencer and said, "Hey, I'm in your town. Why don't you come out to my talk tonight? And by the way, I'm staying at an Airbnb right next to your mother's place, so you should come out." And he did. I didn't expect him to, but he walked in, just before I started to talk. It was very dark. He went up to the balcony, but I saw him. And he sat through my talk. And at the Q&A, the last question was from a gentleman on the other side who said, obviously Richard, Spencer is attached to our town, and our town is getting a lot of heat from that. What do you say to somebody like that? How do we, as a community, approach somebody like him? This was not, in any way scripted, but I turned to him in the balcony and I said, "Richard, let's have a cup of coffee." And I invited him to a cup of coffee because I wanted to just talk to him and listen to him and not make it a debate about politics. Because when we start out on the extremes, we never get a chance to find what we have in common.
We don't listen. Your point earlier is you got to start by listening.
We don't listen. We talked in that everybody had left and we sat in the auditorium for 2 hours and talked. And of course, there were always the political jabs. It was, dare I say, a pleasant conversation with an egomaniac, but I heard his potholes. And you'll have to watch the video because there is a 7-minute video that was shot of that conversation because my talk happened to be taped that night as part of a different documentary, and he allowed the cameras to roll. So maybe I could send you a link for your listeners to watch. It was a piece that I had written on Huffington Post that has a video accompaniment of it. It was fascinating, but I did hear potholes, and I think you'll hear them too when you see the video.
This show's not about politics. I try really hard to steer away from it. But it feels like there's been this surge of racist and anti-Semitic behavior, some cases violence, over the last year. We thought we were moving toward a post-racial and perhaps post-judgmental world, but clearly that's not the case. If anything, it feels like we're moving backwards. Would you agree with that? And if so, why? Why is this happening?
I don't think we're moving backwards. I think we had just swept it under the rug, or, tried to weld the sewer caps on, thinking that if we didn't see them, and part of it was strategy on their part as well, because they didn't want to be seen. It is getting worse. Let me just say that it is starting to attract the average person who, in many cases, let me just say, doesn't know that they're being recruited, doesn't know that they're part of a hate movement. They're just in the early marketing stage of trying to reel them in. Eventually, when they get in, they'll be able to see it, but it may be too hard for them to turn back, and there may be too much damage done, not only to themselves, but our country, and the progress that we've made. But I think we made a mistake of sweeping it under the rug and pretending it didn't exist. Our media didn't really report when incidents happened, but they were very quick to report, terrorist attacks from brown-skinned people, which is also it's also fear rhetoric, right? Even real news is fear rhetoric unless that real news is based and communicated in a logical way, right? If we all of a sudden within 30 seconds of an attack call it, a terrorist attack because the person has brown skin without all the facts coming in of why they did it or who they're aligned with or what's going on, or underreporting white supremacist terrorism, that's also feeding these organizations, because people in rural America, or even, anywhere but California and maybe, New York, think that that is the enemy and that we are under attack by this group of people that is only being reported on. And if white supremacist terrorism isn't being reported, then you just don't think it exists.
Well, if we had swept it under the rug in the past, then I guess the question is, who lifted up the rug? And I'm not suggesting that that was the right approach in the past. I get it. But why now?
I can tell you that the election, and I'm not, listen, I do have political opinions. I'm not interested in political debate saying I'm right and somebody else is wrong. I'm willing to listen to everybody. I love Republicans. I think that they were hijacked, and they don't know it. And the Democratic Party is completely broken. So let me just say that, and that'll be as political as I get. But I think that the election itself, was kind of the bucket of gasoline that was kicked over on all these sparks that already existed. It was a platform that happened, and because of certain things that were either said or not said, or dog whistles, which to me are more bullhorns, it rallied this movement. It gave them a global platform. And also our media, I think, elevated them and kind of brought them into the living rooms of every American. So I think that was the spark that they needed. That was something that unified them, at least through their popularity, their public popularity.
Well, Christian, I know you talk about your reboot, if you will, on life, matter-of-factly. But in reality, it takes a ton of courage to make that kind of dramatic change and walk away from your former life. I mean, you're essentially admitting that what you did for a good part of your life was terribly wrong. So where did that courage come from? What changed inside of you that gave you the confidence to escape the very world that you were unable to escape earlier in your life?
I couldn't have done it without, some very critical people helping me. My family never gave up on me. My friends, there were some that even from before I got involved in that movement reached out and said, hey, I want to help. It was, even a company like IBM, who I ended up working for from 1999 to 2007, that gave me a chance when I didn't really have, do anything to deserve it. I'd been kicked out of 6 high schools, one of them twice. I didn't have a college degree. And I got a temp job for them. It was a manual temp job, but eventually that was the opening that I needed, the opportunity that I needed to prove myself. And I was able to do that. It was, the African American security guard, who on my first day at IBM, where I was sent to my old high school of all places, I don't know if this is karma or God's will or destiny or fate or whatever it is that your listeners want to believe in. But my first day at IBM, my first job was to go set up the computers at my old high school, the same one I'd been kicked out of twice. And there I was terrified, Glenn, because even though I'd been out of the movement now for 5 years, I'd gone through a depression. I was about to lose the thing that was really the only, promising lifeline that I had out of this depression. I was afraid of walking down the halls and being told to go home. And suddenly the old African-American security guard, Mr. Holmes, who I'd gotten in a fist fight with, that got me kicked out of that school for the second time, walked right past me. And he didn't see me, but I recognized him. And I followed him to the parking lot. And when I saw him, and I had for 5 years been outrunning my past. I didn't talk about it. I was hiding it. I wasn't courageous enough to do that. I tapped him on the shoulder, and all I could say to this man who I'd hurt physically, mentally, was, I'm sorry. And eventually, he embraced me and we talked, and he made me promise that I would tell my story, because he recognized that this wasn't just the story of some, broke, abused kid who joined a white supremacist group. It was the story of every young person who's searching for identity, community, and purpose. And he made me promise, in fact, that I would tell that story. And that was the first time that I decided that I needed to find the courage to be able to speak about my past. And my book, White American Youth, is the culmination of that.
Well, there are plenty of white supremacists out there who never shed any of their prejudices. They grow up hating and they die hating. What do you suppose separates someone like you who is able to turn over that new leaf from those that never do?
Opportunity and support. The people who die in that movement are the ones who never find the opportunity to leave it. Because I guarantee you, having known thousands of people, that everybody who's in that movement, at least most of them, want to leave it because they understand how horrific it is and how much damage they're causing when they hurt people. But they need to do that because they need to stay a part of this movement, because they don't have an opportunity to leave it. But given the opportunity, I bet you even Richard Spencer would leave.
Do you ever get death threats?
Every day.
Because you've essentially betrayed the movement. And right, those that are staunch followers probably aren't too crazy about what you're trying to do.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I don't even look anymore. Aside from the death threats, there are websites dedicated to discrediting me, calling me everything from a Pakistani born terrorist who infiltrated the white supremacist movement to the one that I thought was the funniest was that President Obama gave me $10 million before he left office so I could round up white supremacists and put them in FEMA camps. I thought that was a good one.
That's clever.
Yeah, or that I was a plant from the very beginning, whose real name is Abdullah bin Mohammed, to infiltrate the white supremacist movement to plant seeds of ISIS way before ISIS existed. So, and, of course, then there are the ones that, anger me the most, that call me, a rapist and a pedophile and anything to discredit me. Everything from, there was one that called me an alien.
Well, this would be the official first alien interview I've done. So always a first. Do you just tune these people out?
I have to. We live in a world where everybody is entitled to their opinion, and unfortunately, a lot of them are coming from Russian bot technology. So we'll let them just have their day.
Well, if you could go back in time, give the young, struggling, abandoned, teenage Christian Picciolini some life advice, what would it be? What do you say to him?
I would say, you're not stupid. I thought I was stupid.
In what sense?
I just thought because I had lived in such a cultural bubble, that when somebody gave me this information, this white supremacist information, it obviously didn't start out that way. I was fascinated, and I also felt very stupid that I didn't know it already. Because the way they presented it was like I should have known it. Like it was common sense. And I would say, you're not stupid, and you don't need other people to prove your worth. I felt worthless. What I know now, and what I've known for the last 22 years, is that everything I've needed to succeed is inside me. And I need to believe in myself. And even if my lowest points, or if I feel the most marginalized, that my uniqueness is my most powerful weapon. And I don't want to live in a black and white world. I love the complexity of it.
So you're so well equipped to do what you're doing, obviously, given your former life. But how does someone like me help? How do we help? How does our community get involved? What can we do to somehow right the ship?
Well, I think the most important thing that anybody can do is to really show compassion to the people that they feel deserve it the least, because I guarantee you they're the ones who need it the most.
That's really interesting. That's pretty profound. I guess the question is, how do you start that dialogue?
We just have to be human beings and understand that while we may be different in many ways, we are all connected in the most basic way. We are beings who are innately compassionate and empathetic, that we've learned to lose that sometimes. We're all connected as human beings because we all, we want the same fundamental things out of life. I talked earlier about starting in the middle instead of starting from the extremes. If we start from the extremes with people, it never gets an opportunity to get to the middle. If we start with what we have in common, and that could be, the simple fact that we are American, or that you are a man and I'm a man, or that we may come from the same neighborhood, or we want security for our children, we want an education for our, for the people that we love, and health, and all those things that everybody in any place in the world, wants. Then we can start from a place of common understanding, and we can humanize each other in those ways. We're all broken. We all have things that that are afflicting us that we don't talk to anybody about. Every person we meet is dealing with something that we know nothing about. And if we can understand that, if we can understand that we're all connected kind of by our brokenness, then we can find a way to work out to those extremes. And maybe sometimes we'll go, off track, and that's okay, because we're okay. It's okay to be different. And that's the ultimate goal. It's okay to be different.
What you've done with your life is so admirable, but you didn't have to do this. IBM's a fine organization. You could have just gone up the corporate ladder and left this life behind, but you decided to really devote your life toward this cause. Why?
I see it as such an invasive part of our American culture right now, and it's very disturbing. And I've been seeing this for 15 years while I've been doing this work. I've been out for 22. It took me some time to find the courage, 5 years to do that. But for at least the last 15 years, I've seen these signs that only somebody like me can really understand, because I was there. I was part of developing them. I saw this become more normalized over the last 15 years, and that terrified me. And I feel responsible for all the seeds of hate that I planted. And I can tell you, Glenn, that still today I am pulling out the weeds from those same seeds. And I feel like, because I know this information, because I have, I'm one of these unicorns that has been on both sides. It's my responsibility to make sure that nobody who was like me ever gets detoured down that path ever again. And if they are down that path, I want to show them that there's a better way.
The name of this podcast is called The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Excellence, I think, is just being the best human being that you can be. There is no bar of what excellence is that's standard across anybody. I just think that if you are the best human being that you are, that's excellence.
No one's ever answered it that way, and I love your answer. It's usually defined something to do with, business success and this and that. But I think just being the best human you can, that's great.
That's all we can ask for, right? If everybody was just the best human being that they could possibly be, I think the world would be a pretty excellent place.
Well, I'm sure I've got a long way to go myself.
Me too. I'm trying. It's a struggle.
Christian, such a fascinating journey. I can't thank you enough for spending time with me and sharing your story.
My pleasure, Glenn. Thanks for having me on. And I think if people want to understand more, they can go either to my website, which I'm sure you'll post, or read my book. I think it gives it's not just the story of some kid, it's not just my story. It's the story of everybody and what could happen if we don't, support young people in the right ways. But also if we do know somebody who's in that movement, what it is that we need to do to pull them out, because it's not violence. It's not silence. It's compassion and empathy.
Great. Thanks so much, Christian.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.